born in Montana, cast as an Egyptian, fired for being too independent, praised by presidents, banned by fascists, and still she never played the Hollywood game. This isn't the Myrna Loy your grandma told you about. Born into scandal and strangeness. She was born Myrna Adele Williams on the 2nd of August, 1905, in Helena, Montana. Her father, a successful real estate man and state legislator, was respected in town. Her mother, a trained pianist, had other plans. She wanted out. She didn't care much for Helena's social rules or dusty frontier politics. When Myrna was 13, her father died of the flu while traveling. It crushed the family. Her mother packed up Myrna and her younger brother and moved them to Los Angeles. Not for better schools or family. She moved for opportunity and freedom. They landed in the Baldwin Hills area. Money was tight. Myrna was quiet but observant. She liked reading, sketching, and dancing. She joined local theater groups and took ballet. While still in school, she began working at Grauman's Egyptian Theater, not as an actress, but as a silent, still dancer in elaborate Egyptian costume. She stood on pedestals before movies played, arms out, motionless, like a living statue. She was 18 when a photographer snapped her picture and passed it to a silent film casting director. The look got her in. She lied about her experience and said she could act. Her first few roles were background, maids, servants, and unnamed extras. She didn't speak a word on camera for years. Studios didn't see a leading lady. They saw something else. Her sharp cheekbones and almond-shaped eyes got her labeled as exotic. That word would follow her through more than a dozen films. She was cast as a gypsy, a Chinese mistress, a native princess, an Egyptian dancer, even a villainous seductress in fake brownface. It didn't matter that she was of Welsh and Scottish descent. The roles were all stereotypes, and she took what she was offered. By 1927, she had appeared in almost 30 films. No fanfare, no fame yet. Just a long list of names she didn't choose and roles she couldn't shape. But she was watching, learning. She didn't talk back yet, but she didn't forget. Myrna Loy was in Hollywood, and she was paying attention. From background to breakout. By the late 1920s, Myrna Loy was showing up in everything. She didn't turn roles down, she couldn't afford to. She had no agent, no protection, and no real power. In 1 year alone, she appeared in 13 films. Most were silent, most were bad, but she was getting screen time, and that counted. In 1927, she was cast in Across the Pacific, playing a seductive spy. It wasn't a good role, but her screen presence stood out. That same year, she played a vamp in The Heart of Maryland and a native girl in The Jazz Singer, though the film is mostly remembered now for Al Jolson's blackface performance. Myrna had one line, barely lit. Still, she was there. She finally got a credit line in 1929, but that year also came with a challenge. Sound. Hollywood was panicking over the transition to talkies. Some stars couldn't handle the mic. Myrna wasn't one of them. Her voice, calm and low, translated well. She had a smooth rhythm, a clean delivery, nothing shrill or affected. Even with that advantage, the roles stayed the same. In the 1930s The Desert Song, she played yet another veiled beauty. That same year, she appeared in The Black Watch, Cock o' the Walk, and Bride of the Regiment, still boxed in by typecasting. One critic called her a reliable foreigner. But behind the scenes, Myrna was shifting. She started making friends with script supervisors, editors, makeup artists, and anyone who could help her understand how the business worked. She learned how lighting worked, how framing changed a performance. She studied everything. Then came The Animal Kingdom in 1932. It wasn't a big hit, but she played a modern woman, sharp, stylish, and grounded. No accent, no wig, no made-up nationality. And suddenly, producers noticed. That same year, she was cast in Love Me Tonight, opposite Maurice Chevalier. She played a proper French aristocrat, not a seductress, not a threat. For once, she got to be funny, confident, and in control. The Thin Man changed everything. In 1934, everything flipped. Myrna Loy was cast as Nora Charles in The Thin Man. It wasn't a leading role at first. MGM expected the movie to center on the detective, Nick Charles. But from the first scene, Loy stole it. She played Nora with wit, timing, and absolute control. She wasn't just the detective's wife, she was his equal. She drank martinis, cracked jokes, challenged suspects, and lit up the screen without even raising her voice. She made banter look easy. She'd never done comedy like this before. Director W.S. Van Dyke took a chance on her. He was known for shooting fast and loose, sometimes wrapping scenes in one take. Loy thrived in that energy. She didn't rehearse her chemistry with co-star William Powell, it just showed up. They were instantly electric. MGM didn't expect much from The Thin Man. It was a B picture with a modest budget, but it exploded. Audiences fell hard for the married couple who flirted like teenagers and solved murders between cocktails. Critics raved. Loy became an icon overnight. By the end of 1934, she was no longer the girl who played foreigners. She was Nora Charles, and she'd finally become something rare. A woman in film who was smart, funny, and still desirable. No costumes, no seduction plots, but just sharp writing and a sharp performance. MGM rushed to lock her into more films with Powell. They made 5 Thin Man sequels over the next 13 years. Off-screen, they weren't a couple, but their on-screen dynamic was so strong that fans constantly asked if they were married in real life. Quiet battles with the studio. Success didn't make her docile. If anything, it sharpened her resolve. After The Thin Man, MGM wanted to cash in fast. But Myrna Loy wasn't going to say yes to every script they threw at her. She read them carefully. If a character lacked depth or dignity, she passed. That didn't go over well. In 1937, she turned down several roles she found offensive or boring. MGM executives, furious, suspended her without pay. Loy didn't panic. She walked out. Quietly, without a press meltdown. She left Hollywood and, years later, started volunteering with the Red Cross instead. Fans were shocked. So were reporters. Loy didn't give statements. She let the studio sweat. It worked. Within months, MGM came back with a better deal. More control, more say in scripts, and the promise of better roles. She returned on her own terms and made Parnell with Clark Gable and Double Wedding with Powell. The message was clear. She wasn't disposable. Even while under contract, she refused to be treated like property. Studios at the time practically owned their actors, controlling public appearances, interviews, even romantic relationships. Loy said no to arranged dates, photo ops, and fake scandals. She didn't pose for pin-ups or leak stories to gossip columns. She never played the game. She also kept her political opinions quiet but firm. She was a Roosevelt Democrat in a very Republican town. She donated quietly, spoke cautiously, and never used her career to chase headlines. She played it smart, but she never played it safe. Other actresses noticed. Bette Davis, Katharine Hepburn, and Barbara Stanwyck all praised Loy's professionalism. She wasn't flashy, she wasn't scandalous. But she got what she wanted without burning bridges. Banned by Hitler himself. In the late 1930s, Myrna Loy wasn't just a movie star, she was a problem. For dictators, at least. While most Hollywood actors stayed quiet on global politics, Loy spoke out, loudly. In interviews and fundraisers, she criticized Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime. She called fascism a threat to civilization and warned that Hollywood had a responsibility to say something. That didn't go unnoticed. In 1938, the Nazi government officially banned all of Myrna Loy's films in Germany. No Thin Man, no Test Pilot, no Libeled Lady. Her face was pulled from posters. Her name blacklisted. The reasoning? too outspoken. The German press called her a bad influence. Loy didn't care. She took it as a compliment. She doubled down. During World War II, Loy turned down roles she felt undermined the war effort or American morale. Instead of playing on-screen heroes, she focused on real-world service. She refused to make movies while troops were dying overseas. From 1942 to 1945, she didn't appear in a single film. While other stars were on soundstages, Loy was visiting hospitals, writing letters to soldiers, and appearing at military bases, not as a character, but as herself. She used her fame as a tool, not for press, not for career gain, just to help. Hollywood quietly respected it, even if it didn't boost box office. MGM tried to lure her back during the war years with soft comedies and romance scripts. She said no, the work could wait. She wasn't trying to be a symbol. She just didn't believe in playing pretend while real people were dying. That's how she saw it. Years later, she said, "You couldn't be neutral. You were either against Hitler or you were for him." She stormed Washington, too. After the war, most stars returned to Hollywood. Myrna Loy didn't rush. She had other business in Washington. In 1946, President Truman appointed her to the U.S. National Commission for UNESCO, a post usually held by scholars or diplomats, not actors. But Loy wasn't just a face. She had spent years involved in global aid and education efforts during the war. Now she had a seat at the table. She wasn't there for photo ops. She attended real meetings, gave speeches, and wrote memos. In one memo to the White House, she warned that cultural recovery is as essential as economic aid. Her focus? Global literacy, women's education, and post-war rebuilding. This was uncharted territory for a Hollywood actress. Reporters didn't know what to make of it. She wore tailored suits, not gowns. She skipped red carpets and worked long hours without press coverage. One newspaper wrote, "Myrna Loy is acting like a real public servant." She was. In 1948, she joined the National Committee Against Discrimination in Housing. It was one of the first national civil rights groups to target housing segregation. At the time, that wasn't just unpopular, it was dangerous. But Loy didn't flinch. She gave speeches across the country calling redlining a moral failure and urging Congress to take action. She also met with civil rights leaders behind closed doors, offering her name, funding, and platform, but never making it about herself. Back in Hollywood, people asked if she was done with acting. She wasn't. She just wasn't done helping either. She balanced both worlds quietly, never using her activism to market her films. She refused the spotlight. While other stars chased magazine covers and gossip columns, she stayed quiet and in control. She didn't pose for pin-up spreads. She didn't do interviews unless she had something worth saying. And she didn't fake relationships to sell tickets. Studios hated it. In the 1930s and 40s, studio PR teams built entire careers on public image. They paired stars for publicity, leaked dating rumors, and staged photo shoots to make actors look more all-American or glamorous. Loy refused all of it. She never appeared in a scandal. Not once. There were no leaked affairs, no drunken brawls, no feuds with co-stars. But that didn't mean she was boring. It just meant she didn't let the public in. And people wanted in. She was known for being polite but direct. She answered questions with short, sharp replies. When asked how she avoided scandal, she said, "I mind my own business and other people's when it matters." She kept her personal life almost entirely off the record. No tours of her home. No stories about her childhood pets. Her image stayed clean because she guarded it fiercely. Even when she married 4 times, she didn't let the studios use it. Each marriage ended quietly, without headlines or drama. If reporters asked, she shut it down. This only made her more intriguing. Fans projected their own fantasies onto her. They imagined her as Nora Charles, witty, playful, madly in love. But Loy never confirmed or denied anything. She let them wonder. 4 marriages, no regrets. She got married 4 times. None of them lasted. She didn't hide it. She also didn't dwell on it. Her first marriage was in 1936 to producer Arthur Hornblow Jr. On paper, they looked like a power couple. In private, it was cold. They clashed over money, Loy's career, and how much space they needed. She left after 7 years, quietly. Her second husband was John Hertz Jr., heir to the yellow cab fortune. They married in 1942. It lasted less than 2 years. He wanted a wife who stayed home. She wasn't that woman. Her third husband, screenwriter Gene Markey, came next. That one barely made it a year. She later said, "I got married too often because I liked being in love. I got divorced because I also liked being alone." Her final marriage was to a UN diplomat, Howland Sargent. It seemed more stable until it wasn't. They split after 4 years. Loy never remarried. In interviews, she didn't pretend to be heartbroken or bitter. She just didn't want to settle. She often said that men wanted Nora Charles, not her. They loved the version of her from the screen. The clever, loyal, flirtatious wife who never raised her voice and always had a comeback. But that was a character. Loy was sharper, more private, and not willing to play a role off-screen. She never had children. People asked her why. She said she didn't feel the need to explain. By the 1950s, she had made peace with her choices. She wasn't trying to be an ideal woman. She was just trying to be honest. And sometimes, honesty meant walking away. While the press tried to turn her love life into gossip, she stayed ahead of it. No crying interviews, no public fights, just quiet exits and clean breaks. Hollywood tried to replace her. By the mid-1950s, Hollywood had changed, and not in her favor. Younger actresses were being groomed to replace the stars of the 1930s. Studios wanted fresh faces and bigger headlines. Myrna Loy didn't fit the new formula. She wasn't scandalous, she wasn't desperate, and she wasn't willing to beg for parts. After The Bachelor and The Bobby Soxer and Mr. Blandings builds his dream house, offers slowed down, not because she lost her talent, because she aged. She was still in her 40s, still sharp, still bankable, but women in Hollywood had an expiration date, and hers had apparently passed. She refused to play mothers of grown men. She turned down scripts that treated her like background noise. She knew exactly what she brought to the screen, and she wasn't going to fake her way through a role just to stay visible. So she shifted. She started doing stage work in New York, live theater where talent, not youth, was the currency. She performed in Middle of the Night and The Country Girl. Critics praised her timing, her control, her presence. She didn't need a close-up to command a room. She also started speaking publicly about ageism. In 1955, she told a reporter, "Hollywood knows how to build a star. It still hasn't figured out how to keep one." She wasn't bitter. She just wasn't blind. Still, she made a few more films. In Cheaper by the Dozen and Bells on Their Toes, she played matriarchs, but not passive ones. Her characters had edge, opinion, and agency. If she had to age on screen, she'd do it with dignity. Even as her screen time faded, her influence didn't. Directors still called her the most professional woman in the business. Actresses still named her as a blueprint for how to survive Hollywood without losing yourself. She didn't chase relevance. She didn't panic. She just adjusted. Quietly, as always. She walked away, without apology. By the 1960s, Myrna Loy had done what few actresses from her era could say. They retired without becoming a tabloid headline. She didn't make a big announcement. She didn't go on talk shows to explain herself. She just stopped showing up for casting calls. She didn't need to. She had made over 120 films. She had starred alongside William Powell, Clark Gable, Cary Grant, and Spencer Tracy. She had survived the silent era, conquered the studio system, and outlived the contracts meant to control her. She moved to New York and focused on activism, public service, and writing. She published her memoir, Being and Becoming, in 1987. It wasn't filled with Hollywood gossip. It was about identity, about what it meant to be watched, desired, ignored, and misunderstood all at once. In that book, she wrote, "I never had to play dumb. I just had to play it cool." That line summed her up better than any headline ever could. She still attended events when it mattered. She appeared at tributes, film preservation panels, and women's rights fundraisers. But she never tried to reclaim the spotlight. She didn't need to be remembered. She already was. In 1991, she received an honorary Academy Award for her lifetime of work. The crowd gave her a standing ovation. She didn't cry. She made a dry joke, thanked a few names, and walked off stage. Classic Loy. She passed away in 1993, quietly, at age 88. No scandal. No big final act. Just the end of a very long, very rare kind of career. Myrna Loy never gave Hollywood the version of her it wanted. She gave them the version she chose. She never posed half-naked, never leaked a romance, never faked a feud. She didn't have to. She built a legacy without chasing fame. She told off fascists, walked away from bad roles, outsmarted studio heads, and kept her private life exactly that, private. They called her the Queen of Hollywood. She never called herself anything. Because when you do things right, you don't have to explain. One stare stopped a director cold. One scene made censors panic, and one decision nearly ended her career. Gene Simmons didn't hint. She exposed. This isn't your grandmother's Hollywood story. War-era debut with big impact. Gene Simmons was just 14 when she stepped onto a movie set for the first time. The film, Give Us the Moon. It was a light comedy, but casting directors noticed something deeper in her, a mix of innocence and edge that didn't feel rehearsed. By 1945, she landed a small role in Caesar and Cleopatra, acting opposite Vivien Leigh and Claude Rains. Jean had no formal training, but her eyes stole every frame. Even with just a few lines, critics pointed her out. One review said she had more presence than most stars twice her age. That attention didn't go unnoticed. Back in London, she was already becoming a studio favorite. Directors liked that she followed direction perfectly, but still added something of her own. No one could quite explain it. She was quiet, respectful, but then delivered a performance with a surprising heat that caught people off guard. During this time, Britain was still recovering from war. Rationing was in full swing. But Jean was getting fitted for costumes, stepping onto grand sets and showing up in magazines. For a country looking for escape, she became a symbol of post-war hope and a bit of fantasy. Producers began casting her in roles meant for older actresses. She had the look of a teenager, but the screen presence of a woman who'd lived through something. It made her unpredictable and hard to forget. The studios liked that, so did the public. What really set her apart, though, wasn't talent alone. It was how she made every close-up feel intimate. She didn't perform to the camera. She let the camera come to her. That kind of restraint, especially at 15, felt dangerous in the best way. Ophelia role that shocked all. At only 18, she was cast opposite Laurence Olivier, who also directed and starred as Hamlet. It was a bold choice. Some said she was too young, too unknown. But Olivier saw something in her others didn't. The moment the film premiered, critics couldn't stop talking. Her Ophelia was fragile but intense. The breakdown scene where she spirals into madness hit like a punch. She didn't scream or flail. She barely raised her voice, but her eyes, they told a story no one could look away from. One director on set said, "She didn't act the scene. She became it." That scene became one of the most talked about performances of the year. Some called it mesmerizing. Others said it was too much, too raw for such a young actress. The censors weren't thrilled either. They flagged her emotional scenes as too suggestive, even though she wasn't doing anything explicit. Just her face, sad, broken, and unfiltered, made people uncomfortable. Not because she did something wrong, but because she did it too well. Her performance earned her an Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actress. It was rare for a British actress that young to get that kind of recognition in Hollywood, but Jean made it look effortless. What no one saw, though, was how tightly controlled the set was. Olivier was known to push actors hard. Simmons was often left exhausted after long takes. Some scenes took over a dozen tries just to get the right version of her breakdown. She never complained. Hamlet didn't just boost her career. It showed the world she wasn't afraid of complex roles. She didn't need flashy lines or big gestures. She used silence, stillness, and just one look. This wasn't a breakout. This was a warning. Jean Simmons didn't just belong in movies. She could change how they felt. Barefoot and bold in Himalayas. Jean Simmons wasn't the lead in Black Narcissus, but she might as well have been. She played Kanchi, a teenage girl from the Himalayas. No lines, no backstory, just movement, emotion, and presence. And it was enough to shake audiences and critics. She wore a thin sari, little makeup, and walked barefoot in most scenes. Her performance wasn't subtle. It was bold, sensual, and totally silent. For someone trained in British restraint, she went the other way completely. Viewers couldn't believe it was the same girl from Hamlet. The censors? They freaked out. A British girl in brownface was already controversial, but it was her physicality, how she walked, how she looked at men, how she moved through space, that made it feel charged. Some scenes were almost cut. Critics didn't know whether to praise her or scold her. What made it even wilder? Jean was only 19. She wasn't experienced in dance or physical theater. She learned everything on the spot, guided by directors Powell and Pressburger. They told her, "Don't think, just feel." And she did. The result was magnetic. Behind the scenes, Simmons was nervous. She worried about looking ridiculous. She hated the heavy body makeup. But when she saw the final cut, she realized she'd done something rare. She made people watch without saying a word. Her performance added tension to a film already full of it. Nuns fighting desire, isolation in the mountains, repressed emotions ready to blow. Jean's character was the spark, the reminder that human want couldn't be hidden forever. She wasn't glamorized. She wasn't polished. She was raw and young and almost too real for the screen. Audiences either gasped or looked away. That role changed everything. From then on, casting directors saw her differently. She could play quiet, yes, but she could also play dangerous. Not loud or messy, but the kind of dangerous that sneaks up on you. Marriage that silenced her voice. She married Stuart Granger in 1950. On paper, it looked like a Hollywood love story. He was a big name. She was the rising star. The press called them elegant, glamorous, perfect. But the truth behind the curtain was less romantic and a lot more complicated. Granger was 16 years older. He was already famous when Jean met him on set. Their chemistry started fast. So did the control. Soon after the wedding, Granger took the reins. On decisions, on deals, even on what roles she took. The studios loved the image. They paraded the couple in magazines. But people close to Jean started noticing changes. She lost weight. She got quieter on set. Her fire was still there, but it felt dimmed. Granger didn't hide his jealousy. He hated how much attention Jean got. When she was offered lead roles, he often stepped in, saying the scripts weren't right for her. Some insiders say he even turned down roles on her behalf without telling her. Their marriage became a talking point, not for romance, but for the tension it created in her career. One studio exec said, "Jean was gold, but we couldn't get to her without going through Stuart." Still, she stayed, at least for a while. She did interviews with a smile. She played the devoted wife. But behind closed doors, she started pushing back. She wanted control over her own contracts. She wanted to work in America. Granger wasn't happy about it. The tension spilled into work. On the set of Young Bess, she reportedly clashed with crew members over last-minute changes made by Granger, who was constantly advising from behind the scenes. By the early 50s, it was clear this marriage wasn't boosting her career. It was stalling it, and Jean knew it. The girl who once shocked the screen in silence was now fighting to speak up off it. She sued Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes didn't hear no very often, but Gene Simmons gave it to him clear, firm, and without a pause. In 1951, she was under contract with the Rank organization in the UK, but Hughes wanted her for RKO in Hollywood, so he bought her contract. At first, it looked like a career jackpot. Bigger films, bigger budget, international stardom. But there was a catch. Hughes didn't want to make her a star. He wanted to own her. He sent her lavish gifts, jewelry, perfume, clothes. She sent them right back. He offered her roles, but only in projects he controlled. Scripts were delayed, promises were broken. Gene was stuck, contractually tied to RKO but barely working. Then came the final straw. Hughes tried to force her into a long-term extension. Gene said no. He pushed harder. She pushed back and sued him. That was a career gamble very few actresses would have dared to make, especially against a man with Hughes' power and reach. The court battle was ugly. She was accused of being ungrateful, difficult, spoiled, but she didn't flinch. Her attorney argued Hughes was deliberately obstructing her career, and he was. The judge sided with Gene. The court granted her the right to make one more film under RKO, but after that, she was free. That final film would be Angel Face. More on that next. The whole ordeal made headlines. Gene had taken on one of Hollywood's biggest moguls, and won. What made it wild wasn't just that she fought back, it was how calm she stayed doing it. No public outbursts, no gossip columns, just quiet, steady defiance. After the case, other actresses started to take note. Simmons had done what they were told was impossible. She stood up to the system without destroying herself in the process. Slip dress scene that stung. Angel Face was supposed to be just another noir, but Gene Simmons turned it into something unforgettable and nearly unwatchable for the censors. Directed by Otto Preminger, the film paired her with Robert Mitchum in a twisted love story full of mind games and manipulation. From her first scene, something felt off. In a good way, she wore a silk slip and moved through the frame like she knew exactly how much control she had. It was quiet, calculated, dangerous. Preminger pushed her hard. Some days she left set in tears. One scene, where she slaps Mitchum, turned chaotic. He slapped her back. For real. Not in the script. The camera kept rolling. That take made it into the final cut. The most talked about scene was filmed in her bedroom. Gene wore a skimpy nightgown that barely passed code. Her expression? Cold, unreadable, hypnotic. Studio executives tried to reshoot it. Preminger refused. Simmons never apologized. The scene stayed. Critics weren't sure what to make of her. One said she was too still, too unreadable. Another called her performance the quietest form of violence ever filmed. Audiences didn't know whether to root for her or run from her. That's exactly what Preminger wanted. Off-screen, Simmons kept it professional, but distant. She didn't like Preminger's style, but she respected the result. "It wasn't fun," she once said, but it worked. She knew what the role demanded, and she gave it, without blinking. Angel Face didn't do big box office, but it became a cult classic. Directors studied it, actresses copied her stillness, and fans replayed that one-bedroom scene like it was gospel. It proved she could lead a film, and terrify you doing it. This wasn't Gene Simmons the ingenue, this was Gene Simmons with teeth, and once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. Backless photos stirred a storm. The robe was supposed to be a biblical epic, clean, reverent, traditional, but Gene Simmons made sure it came with a side of scandal, not because of anything in the script, but because of a single photograph. A promotional shot of Simmons in costume, barebacked, turned slightly, eyes locked on the lens, made its way into a national magazine. And suddenly people weren't talking about Roman history. They were talking about that image. She wasn't unclothed, but she didn't need to be. The curve of her back, the look on her face, it was suggestive without trying. It sparked a wave of backlash from conservative groups. Some theaters threatened to pull the film unless the image was censored. The studio quickly ordered retouched versions covering her back with added fabric. Simmons didn't protest. She also didn't apologize. What most people didn't know was that the robe marked the beginning of her freedom. It was her first film after winning her legal battle with Howard Hughes and RKO. No more interference, no more stalled scripts. She was finally in control of her career, or so she thought. Behind the scenes, she was still untangling contract fallout. Though legally free, industry politics meant many producers were hesitant to cast her right away. Her refusal to play by studio rules made her difficult. So even as The Robe became a box office hit, Jean was still proving she was bankable and independent. She was also stepping into a new kind of role, the strong, morally complex woman. No longer the wide-eyed ingenue, she now played characters torn by faith, loyalty, and quiet desire. That's what made her stand out in The Robe. While others delivered grand speeches, Jean did more with a glance or a pause. Staring down Spartacus with fire. By the mid-1950s, Jean Simmons had mastered the art of subtle danger. She didn't have to raise her voice or storm into a room to command attention. One stare from her could flip the energy of an entire scene, and nowhere was that more obvious than in Spartacus. She played Varinia, strong-willed, patient, deeply loving. But she wasn't just the love interest. She was the emotional core of the film, the quiet resistance behind Spartacus's rebellion. When Kirk Douglas's character meets her, she doesn't beg or flirt. She watches, she listens, and that look, equal parts softness and defiance, spoke volumes. The film was massive, huge budget, massive cast, but Simmons never got lost in the crowd. Even surrounded by warriors and senators, her presence held steady. One key scene in a bathhouse, fully clothed but emotionally bare, had audiences holding their breath. She wasn't there to seduce, but somehow she did. Director Stanley Kubrick said she could do more with silence than most actors could with 3 pages of dialogue. And that was true. She didn't rely on flashy performances. Her strength was restraint, holding back just enough to make viewers lean in. Her chemistry with Douglas was real, on screen at least. Off-screen, things were more tense. Douglas, ever the perfectionist, reportedly tried to direct her at times. Jean didn't bite. She followed Kubrick's lead and stuck to her style, one that didn't need constant rehearsal or rewrites, just space to breathe. What made Spartacus different was that it showed how far she had come. She was no longer being told how to act, dress, or behave. She chose this role, and she shaped it into something bigger than what was on the page. By now, Simmons had developed a signature move, holding the camera's gaze just a second too long. It was never overdone. Just enough to make the audience shift in their seats. That was her gift. Making discomfort feel beautiful. Making modesty feel provocative. Post-divorce roles, no apologies. When Jean Simmons divorced Stuart Granger in 1960, Hollywood expected her to fade into the background. Instead, she did the opposite. She stepped into some of the boldest roles of her career. She wasn't trying to shock anyone, but she was finally calling the shots. And the first move? Elmer Gantry. In the film, she played Sister Sharon Falconer, a preacher with power, mystery, and unshakable confidence. Opposite Burt Lancaster, Simmons didn't flinch. Their chemistry felt electric, even hostile at times. Her character wasn't there to be conquered. She had her own mission and her own secrets. The role marked a shift. This was Jean fully in control. No studio head pulling strings, no husband weighing in, and it showed. Critics called her performance chillingly calm and quietly commanding. Audiences saw a version of Simmons they hadn't before, fierce, focused, and completely in her element. After that, the walls came down. In interviews, she started to speak more candidly. She admitted how controlled her earlier career had been. She talked about being dressed like a doll, told where to sit, when to smile. "I wasn't rebellious," she said, "I just had a brain." She also started choosing roles that mirrored her real-life complexity. In Life at the Top, she played a woman trapped in a cold marriage, giving one of her most emotionally raw performances. Critics noted how much pain she conveyed without raising her voice. Simmons had always known how to make silence speak, but now it screamed. By 1964, she had officially left her ingenue past behind. Her new characters were layered, modern, and sometimes bitter, but never weak. Whether playing women burned by love or cornered by power, Simmons always brought a sharp, grounded realism. Her personal life, she kept it quiet, no tabloid stunts, just work, and that work spoke volumes. Gene Simmons had survived the studio system, defied Hollywood men, and walked away from a toxic marriage. What came next wasn't a comeback, it was her full arrival. TV role that changed everything. In 1983, when most of her peers had faded into cameos or early retirement, Gene Simmons made a move that surprised everyone. She went to television. And not just any TV role. She signed on for the Thornbirds, a sweeping, high-stakes miniseries that would become a cultural event. She played Fiona Cleary, the cold, emotionally distant matriarch of the family. It was a huge shift from the warm, gentle characters people associated with Simmons. Fiona wasn't cruel, but she wasn't loving either. She was closed off, wounded, and quietly ruthless. And Gene played her with absolute control. Audiences didn't just watch the Thornbirds, they devoured it. Nearly 100 million people tuned in. Simmons held her ground against heavy hitters like Richard Chamberlain and Barbara Stanwyck, and in some scenes she stole the spotlight entirely. It wasn't just the lines she delivered, it was how she sat, how she paused, how she looked away at just the right second. For that performance, she won the Emmy. But more than that, she won back visibility. She proved that actresses over 50 weren't just background players. They could lead, they could drive a story, and they could be just as bold, if not bolder, than they'd been decades earlier. Behind the scenes, Simmons was calm, professional, and laser-focused. Younger cast members described her as gracious but guarded. She wasn't there for gossip, she was there to work. One crew member recalled, "She'd walk onto set, say almost nothing, and nail it on the first take." That role capped off her transformation, from teenage ingenue to Hollywood rebel, from silent power to full-on matriarch. She had nothing left to prove, but somehow still delivered performances that left audiences stunned. Gene Simmons didn't reinvent herself, she just kept showing up exactly as she was, smart, subtle, and impossible to ignore. And by the time the Thornbirds aired, one thing was clear. She never needed to scream to make the whole room gasp. She was the scream queen, the beautiful ghoul who kept horror fans at the edge of their seats for decades. This gorgeous and voluptuous lady knew just how to keep her fans coming back for more, and as a result of this, she made a name for herself as one of the most celebrated actresses in British horror cinema. But beyond the accomplishments and behind the scenes was a woman the world barely knew. From her dislike for watching horror films to her horrific real-life experiences, Ingrid Pitt's story will leave you wondering if you really knew her. Surviving the Nazis. Ingrid spent the most part of her life bringing horror stories to life, but what a lot of people don't know is that this actress was most likely good at depicting horror because she went through horrific experiences as a child. In a 2006 interview, she told with the New Zealand Herald this, "I think it's very amazing that I do horror films when I had this awful childhood, but maybe that's why I'm good at it." It all started on the 21st of November 1937 in Poland, where Ingrid was born in the midst of chaos. Over the years, there have been speculations that her real name was Ingushka Petrov, a name she later changed for personal reasons. Her father, who was German, and her mother, who was a Polish Jew, were both set to raise their children when life took an unexpected and horrific turn. A few years after Ingrid was born, tragedy struck. The Nazis picked up her family, and before she knew what was happening, Ingrid was separated from her father and her older sister. She had no idea where her father and sister were taken to, but was taken to the Stutthof concentration camp with her mother, where she came face to face with a real-life horror experience. Ingrid was just 5 years old at the time. One can only how traumatic this experience was. She saw little girls being maltreated and sexually assaulted. Ingrid also witnessed the death of her own mother's best friend.
All these horrific things were happening right in front of her, but all she could do was to hope and pray that fate had a better plan and that sometime in the near future all these would come to an end. Sadly, the torture didn't end as soon as she hoped. Her and her mother were held there for the next 3 years with no hopes of returning to their normal lives. However, it was in the midst of this dark reality that she began to dream of a better life. She would often lay in the straw, imagining what her life would look like if she was someone else. There was something inside of her that made her believe that she was going to experience life through a different lens. Perhaps a life that was not marked by the confines and terrors of a concentration camp. From dream to reality. After 3 long and hard years, Ingrid and her mother left the camp after the war and began searching for her father and sister. Unfortunately, their hopes of reuniting the family dashed when her father was found. He had become a shadow of himself, and he passed away shortly after. During that period, Ingrid started nursing dreams of becoming an actress, and she decided to pursue this passion fiercely. She was said to have gotten involved in theater productions before she started her screen career. She became a well-known actress on the East Berlin stage, and the time she spent performing in theater enabled her to hone her skills before she started appearing in films. She spent the most part of the mid-1960s appearing in Spanish films. However, her roles were mostly uncredited. Interestingly, Ingrid could not speak Spanish at the time, but still found a way to immerse herself in the industry with the hopes of going international one day. Thankfully, her efforts paid off, and things started looking up for her when she landed a supporting role in the 1968 film Where Eagles Dare. In this film, she portrayed the role of Agent Heidi, and she appeared alongside Richard Burton and Clint Eastwood. This was the role that led to her being noticed by the executives of Hammer Film Productions. They knew that her Eastern European and glamorous looks combined with her talent was a recipe for success. Shortly after, she was given the role of vampiress Mircalla and was the beginning of a notable career in the horror genre, becoming the Queen of Horror. Ingrid's journey into the world of horror began in the late 1960s and early 1970s, an era marked by the resurgence of Gothic horror films. With her striking beauty, commanding screen presence, and a voice that could send shivers down your spine, Ingrid quickly became a sensation in the genre. It all started with her breakout role in The Vampire Lovers in 1970, a film that not only showcased her acting prowess but also solidified her status as a horror icon. As the enigmatic bloodsucker, Ingrid brought a seductive allure to the screen, redefining the image of female vampires in the process. But it wasn't just about the fangs and the supernatural. Ingrid Pitt had a way of infusing her characters with depth and complexity. In Countess Dracula 1971, she portrayed the notorious Countess Elizabeth Bathory, blending horror with historical drama. The film wasn't just a showcase of her ability to instill fear, it was a masterclass in the art of combining terror with a touch of tragic humanity. Ingrid's reign as the Queen of Horror continued with films like The House That Dripped Blood, still in 1971, and The Wicker Man, 1973, where her performances left an indelible mark on the minds of horror enthusiasts. It wasn't just about the scares, it was about the intensity she brought to every role, making her characters memorable and iconic in the annals of horror history. Off-screen, Ingrid Pitt became a beloved figure at horror conventions and fan events. Her genuine love for the genre and her fans endeared her to a loyal following. It wasn't just about the roles she played, it was about the connection she forged with those who reveled in the thrill of a good horror tale. As the Queen of Horror, Ingrid Pitt's legacy lives on. Her impact on the genre transcends the screen, echoing through the corridors of cinematic history. In the darkened theaters of the past and the living rooms of devoted fans, Ingrid's presence endures, a testament to the enduring allure of horror and the woman who reigned as its beloved queen. She authored several books. Beyond the eerie glow of the silver screen, Ingrid Pitt ventured into the world of words, leaving her mark as not just the Queen of Horror on film, but also as a talented author. The same voice that sent shivers down spines now weaving tales on the pages of books. Ingrid's literary journey took flight with a series of books that reflected her deep passion for storytelling. Among her notable works is Life's a Scream, 1986, a memoir that peeled back the curtain on her life, offering readers a glimpse into the highs, lows, and thrills of her journey in the film industry. It wasn't just a recounting of her experiences, it was a narrative that mirrored the spirited, fearless woman behind the character she portrayed. In addition to her memoir, Ingrid explored the realms of fiction. Cuckoo Run in 1985 and The Bedside Companion for Vampire Lovers, 1973, co-authored with David J. Skal, showcased her versatility as a storyteller. The former, a suspenseful novel, demonstrated her ability to craft narratives that extended beyond the horror genre, while the latter delved into the lore and allure of vampires, a subject close to her heart. Ingrid Pitt wasn't content with merely entertaining. She aimed to share her love for the macabre and mysterious. Her books became a bridge between her and her fans, allowing them to delve deeper into the mind of the woman who had become an icon of horror. As an author, Ingrid's voice resonated with the same charisma that made her a beloved figure on screen. Her words painted vivid landscapes of terror, romance, and suspense, inviting readers to step into the realms she conjured with her pen.
The year was 1943. A film sat locked in vaults too scandalous for theaters. At the center, a woman lying in hay rewriting what was allowed on screen. This wasn't Monroe or Gardner. It was Jane Russell, and her story only gets wilder from here. The bra that launched a legend. The Outlaw wasn't supposed to be a scandal. It was a low-budget Western by Howard Hughes, starring a newcomer named Jane Russell. But Hughes had something bigger in mind. He didn't just want a movie, he wanted shock value. Russell was only 21, with no major roles behind her. Hughes cast her as Rhea McDonald, a sultry saloon girl. During filming, he became obsessed with how her figure appeared on screen. Costumes didn't give him the look he wanted, so he built his own solution, a new kind of bra. Metal rods, wiring, and padding were sewn into a custom design meant to lift her bust unnaturally high. Hughes even filed a patent for it. Jane hated it. "That thing hurt like hell," she said years later. "I threw it in the trash and wore my own." Despite that, Hughes told the press she wore his invention. He wanted the story to spread, and it did. Then came the haystack photo. A publicity still showed Russell reclining in hay, blouse barely holding on. No moviegoers cared about the plot. They wanted to see that image. Theaters received angry letters. Religious groups protested. One censorship board called the photo morally dangerous. The production code refused to approve the movie. Hughes had a plan. He sent fake protest letters to theaters claiming outrage from concerned citizens. It worked. Curious crowds showed up in droves. The limited release in 1943 was chaos. In New York and Los Angeles, people lined up for blocks. In some cities, police were called to manage traffic. Chicago shut the film down mid-run. Jane Russell had barely opened her mouth on screen, but her image was already burned into American culture. The Outlaw didn't make her a star because of her acting. It made her a symbol of everything Hollywood was afraid to show. The full nationwide release didn't happen until 1946. By then, she didn't need it. She was already the most talked about woman in Hollywood. And she had done it without saying a word. Headlines, contracts, and control. After The Outlaw stirred controversy in 1943, Jane Russell's name never left the papers, but behind the headlines, she was caught in a mess of studio politics, lawsuits, and image control. She hadn't asked for any of it. Howard Hughes had her locked under an exclusive contract. That meant no other studio could touch her, and she couldn't choose her roles. She later said, "I was stuck doing whatever he wanted. I couldn't even accept better parts." For years, Hughes refused to loan her out, even when major studios begged. Warner Brothers, MGM, and Paramount all showed interest. Hughes said no. During that time, Jane wasn't making movies. Instead, she was doing press, magazine covers, pin-up shoots, public appearances. It was all meant to keep her famous without ever stepping on set. She became one of the most photographed women in America without releasing a single new film. Then came the court battles. Film censors still tried to block the outlaw from playing nationwide. Hughes fought back with everything he had: lawyers, appeals, even threats to pull his other films from theaters. Jane stayed quiet in public, but admitted later she hated the circus. "I wanted to act, not pose for ads." In 1946, the film finally got wide release. It made millions. Critics weren't kind. Most called the acting wooden and the story dull. But it didn't matter. People came to see her. Hughes had turned Jane into a brand, not an actress. Finally, in 1947, Jane got a new project, Young Widow. It was her first non-Hughes production. The script had depth, and she was eager to prove she could act. But the damage had been done. Audiences still saw her as the hey girl. Reviews were mixed. Some praised her presence. Others said she was stiff. She later admitted she was still learning. Still, she wasn't going away. The public had decided Jane Russell was worth watching, even if no one could agree on why. For better or worse, her image had already outgrown the screen. And Hughes? He still wasn't done pulling the strings. Jane versus Hollywood. By 1948, Jane Russell was trapped between fame and frustration. She was known everywhere, but barely working. Hughes continued to control her roles and turn down outside offers. She started to push back. Hughes offered her a part in The Paleface, a comedy western with Bob Hope. Jane didn't think she could do comedy, but she said yes just to get back in front of a camera. It turned out to be a smart move. The film was a hit. Audiences loved her timing, and critics admitted she held her own next to Hope. It was the first time she got to show range. But things weren't smooth behind the scenes. Jane had no power over her career choices. Hughes micromanaged every decision. He approved costumes, scripts, even haircuts. Jane called him obsessed with control. She began quietly asking her lawyers for a way out of the contract. Meanwhile, gossip columns tracked her every move. She was photographed constantly but rarely quoted. Journalists described her as cool, hard to read, and aloof. In truth, she was tired of being treated like a mannequin. Her public image was sex symbol. In private, she was religious, blunt, and preferred quiet. In 1949, she shot The Big Steal with Robert Mitchum. The production was rushed because Mitchum had just been arrested for marijuana possession. The studio needed good press fast. Jane agreed to the project on short notice. It was a basic crime story, but again, she handled it well. Mitchum later said, "Jane was tougher than anyone gave her credit for." She wanted more like that, less glamour, more grit. But Hughes still had her locked down. In 1950, she publicly clashed with studio heads over the roles she was being offered. She turned down several scripts and refused to pose for certain publicity shots. That made her difficult in Hollywood terms. Jane wasn't playing along anymore. She wanted to act, not sell. And slowly, people were starting to listen. The pinup girl had found her voice, and she was just getting warmed up. Diamonds, blondes, and a stolen show. In 1953, Jane Russell landed what should have been a supporting role. Instead, she nearly stole the film. The movie? Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. Her co-star? Marilyn Monroe. Monroe played the sweet, flirty Lorelei. Jane played Dorothy, the sharp brunette who called the shots. On paper, Marilyn was the lead. But on screen, Jane dominated scene after scene. Her timing was cleaner. Her delivery was drier. Her attitude? Unshakable. Most people don't know this. Jane didn't want to do it at first. She thought the musical numbers were silly, but the studio pushed her in, and once filming started, she didn't hold back. She handled her own vocals, danced in heels, and rewrote parts of her dialogue. Monroe had more screen time, but Jane had more control. Crew members said Russell often calmed Marilyn down between takes. She reportedly helped block scenes and guided Monroe through complex shots. Then came the premiere drama. Here's the rumor. Monroe refused to attend the Blonde's premiere in Hollywood, so Jane showed up alone and played both roles on the red carpet. She even signed Monroe's name for fans. Reporters called her a total pro and said she carried the night without breaking a sweat. The movie became a global hit. Jane's performance was praised for being grounded and funny, while Marilyn got the attention for her beauty. But behind the scenes, even executives said Jane held the film together. She never bragged about it. In interviews, she gave Monroe credit and avoided drama. But those who worked on the film knew the truth. Jane was the adult in the room. She showed up on time, knew her lines, and never cracked under pressure. That role cemented her as more than a body or a photo. She could act, she could command, and she could outshine a legend without even trying. Hollywood had underestimated her again, but this time everyone saw what she could really do, and Jane didn't need hay or headlines to prove it. The Hollywood Bowl baptism. In 1954, Jane Russell shocked fans again, but this time it had nothing to do with movies or costumes. She stepped into the waters of the Hollywood Bowl in front of thousands and got baptized. It wasn't a publicity stunt. Jane had always kept her faith private. She was raised in a deeply religious home and read the Bible daily. But the tension between her image and her values was growing. After years of posing in tight gowns and playing bombshell roles, she wanted to make a statement. That statement came during a Billy Graham revival event. The massive crowd watched as Jane walked into the water and was fully submerged. It made headlines the next morning. "Movie siren gets saved," one paper wrote. Others called it a mid-career pivot, but Jane didn't care. After that, she became more vocal about her beliefs. She gave interviews criticizing the moral direction of Hollywood. She said too many films celebrated sin and called some of her past work foolish. She even started a group called WAIF, World Adoption International Fund, combining her faith and advocacy. This turn confused people. She was still doing movies and still dressing glamorously, but now she was talking about Jesus on talk shows. Some fans loved it, others tuned out. The industry didn't know how to handle her shift. She didn't back down. In public speeches, she warned young actors to stay grounded and avoid the fast track to ruin. In private, she mentored struggling performers behind the scenes. But not everyone supported her. Some Hollywood insiders mocked her open faith. She was accused of being judgmental and old-fashioned. Producers called her unpredictable. Studios didn't know if she'd promote a film or preach at the premiere. Jane didn't care. She wasn't asking for approval anymore. The woman once labeled too hot for theaters was now talking about redemption and doing it on her own terms. And while the cameras rolled on others, Jane rewrote her own script in real life. Fight with the church. After several miscarriages, she decided to adopt, but adoption in the 1950s wasn't simple, especially across borders. Her first adopted son, Tommy, came from Ireland. The process took over a year. Jane grew frustrated with red tape and church politics. She believed too many kids were stuck in orphanages while paperwork dragged on. In interviews, she called the system heartless and said it cared more about rules than children. So she took matters into her own hands. In one case, she flew overseas, met with the child's caretakers, and returned with the baby before full approval. She claimed it was legal under emergency conditions. Authorities disagreed. The press labeled it baby smuggling. Jane called it saving a life. That incident pushed her to create WAIF, the World Adoption International Fund. It helped connect orphans with families worldwide. Jane used her fame to pressure lawmakers and raise money. She testified in front of Congress and worked with embassies to change regulations. But the backlash was real. Catholic leaders in Ireland accused her of undermining church-run orphanages. One priest called her reckless and self-righteous. Jane fired back, saying the church cared more about control than compassion. Despite the criticism, she expanded her work. WAIF helped place hundreds of children in homes during its peak. Jane personally reviewed applications and even helped pay travel costs for some families. She wasn't just a spokesperson, she was hands-on. This wasn't the Hollywood work people expected from a screen siren, but Jane didn't care about expectations. She said, "If I'd waited for the world's approval, I'd still be posing in hay." Her house in California became a hub for her causes. Her kids lived outside the spotlight, and she rarely talked about them publicly, but in her later interviews she called them her greatest work. The roles in film paid the bills. The work in adoption, she said, saved her soul. Russell versus feminism. In an era when women's liberation was gaining momentum, Jane took the opposite path, and she made sure everyone knew it. She called second-wave feminism a mess of angry women yelling about problems they created. In one 1973 interview, she said, "I don't know what they're fighting for. I never had to fight for anything." That quote alone set off a storm. Talk show hosts loved booking her. She clashed with feminist guests and stood her ground, even when audiences booed. She argued that women already had power but were wasting it on resentment. "I've worked with men my whole life," she said. "I never needed to burn my bra to get respect." Her words drew backlash. Gloria Steinem's supporters called her outdated. Some women's groups urged sponsors to drop her from endorsements. But Russell didn't flinch. She said modern feminists misunderstood strength. Strength isn't about shouting. It's about knowing who you are. She also attacked Hollywood for portraying women as helpless victims or hypersexualized cliches. Ironically, critics pointed out that her early roles did exactly that. Jane didn't deny it, but said the problem wasn't the image. It was the intention behind it. By this time, she was focused on her religious activism and charity work. But her conservative takes made headlines more than her advocacy. She called Roe v. Wade a mistake and said America needed less therapy and more churches. She wasn't trying to please anyone. The feminist movement saw her as a relic. Her fans saw her as fearless. Either way, she stayed visible. While other actresses her age faded quietly, Jane Russell kept showing up, louder, bolder, and completely unwilling to change. Love her or hate her, she refused to play the part anyone handed her. At 60 and still breaking rules. In the 1980s, most actresses from Jane Russell's era were long retired, not Jane. At 60, she signed a national ad deal to model Playtex bras. The ads ran on television, in magazines, and in stores across America. Most women her age were expected to disappear from the spotlight, but Jane showed up in full glam, pitching support bras to real women. The tagline, "Does your bra have to show your age?" Jane didn't think so. Critics rolled their eyes. She didn't care. "I wore bras before most of these ad execs were born," she joked in an interview. "I know what works." And she meant it. The campaign was a hit. Sales spiked, especially among older women who saw her as relatable, not ridiculous. But this comeback wasn't just about ads. She started making more public appearances again, church groups, charity galas, even morning talk shows. She wasn't doing movies, but she wasn't fading away either. She found a way to stay in front of the public without pretending to be younger than she was. And she wasn't afraid to call out ageism. When a reporter asked if she'd consider a comeback film, she replied, "Sure, if they let me play a 60-year-old woman who acts like one." She also joked that it was the first time in her life people cared about her comfort more than her figure. Back then it was all underwire and pain. Now it's all soft cups and scents. Took long enough. The lingerie campaign made headlines, not for shock, but for surprise. No one expected Jane Russell, the once silent symbol of scandal, to become the face of grown-up confidence. She wasn't trying to seduce anymore. She was trying to relate. And that hit harder than any bombshell act ever could. In a business that tossed women aside after 40, Jane Russell didn't just refuse to disappear. She came back in a bra and reminded the world who she was. And she did it with a wink, not an apology. Outspoken, unfiltered, and unbothered. While most Golden Age stars slipped into quiet retirement, Jane cranked up the volume. She gave interviews that often went viral, at least by pre-internet standards. On one local television segment, she called modern movies trash with sound effects. She criticized rising stars for acting like victims instead of women. One host tried to steer her back to polite conversation. Jane doubled down. She also leaned harder into politics. She identified as a proud conservative, supported prayer in schools, and spoke at several Republican events. She criticized Hollywood's moral decay and said most actors today were spoiled and spineless. These statements didn't win her new fans, but they kept her in the press. In 1999, she made headlines again for all the wrong reasons. She was arrested for driving under the influence in California. Her blood alcohol level was nearly twice the legal limit. At the time, she was in her late 70s. The tabloids pounced. "Busted bombshell," read one headline. She didn't deny it, she didn't spin it, and she definitely didn't apologize in public. Instead, she joked about it later, saying, "At my age, you're lucky to get a story printed about you, even if it's for drinking." Even when called out, she rarely backed down. In one interview, she admitted she didn't believe in political correctness. "I say what I mean, and if you don't like it, turn the channel." No apologies to the end. She passed away in 2011 at the age of 89. True to form, her final years were lived without filters, edits, or apologies. She spent her last decade mostly in Santa Maria, California, staying active in her church and speaking at local events. Neighbors described her as approachable but blunt. If you asked about her past, she'd answer, but she wouldn't sugarcoat it. She didn't do nostalgic interviews. She didn't attend retrospectives. When asked why she skipped award shows or tributes, she said, "I didn't go for applause when I was working. Why would I show up for it now?" In her final interviews, she remained firm in her views. She still rejected modern feminism, still criticized Hollywood's direction, and still defended her early work, even the parts people once called scandalous. "I gave the public what they wanted," she said, "and I did it on my own terms." She also spoke about faith until the end. Church was her real stage, and she liked it that way. She called it the only place that never asked me to be something else. When news of her death broke, the headlines were predictable. Most focused on the outlaw, the hay photo, and her body. Few highlighted her decades of charity work, her fights with censors, or the fact that she'd outlasted most of her peers. Her family didn't issue a long statement. They said she passed peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by loved ones. No funeral spectacle, no red carpet send-off. And that felt right, because Jane Russell never needed the spotlight. She was the kind of star who took it, then handed it back when she was done. No legacy spin, no last-minute reinvention, just one final act of doing exactly what she always had. Living loud, aging honestly, and refusing to ever play by someone else's script. You know Gene Tierney from Laura and Heaven Can Wait, but you don't know the woman the studios tried to hide. This is the real story, stripped bare. Beauty breaks onto Broadway. Before Hollywood ever lit up her name, Gene Tierney was already turning heads on the East Coast. Born in Brooklyn in 1920, she grew up surrounded by books, manners, and pressure. Her father was a successful insurance broker. Her mother was a gym teacher with sharp posture and high expectations. Jean was raised to be proper, but deep down, she wanted to be seen. At 17, she visited Warner Brothers Studios during a family trip to California. A cameraman caught her profile and said, "You ought to be in pictures." That one offhand comment changed everything. But her father insisted she finish school first. She studied at finishing school in Switzerland, learned French, and returned poised, almost too poised. By the time she debuted at a society ball in 1938, her beauty was talked about in papers. Still, she wasn't content to be a debutante. She wanted the stage. She landed her first Broadway role in What a Life in 1938. The part was small, but critics noticed her presence. The New York Times called her striking, and that was all it took. She quickly booked another role in The Male Animal, where one particular audience member, 20th Century Fox founder Darryl F. Zanuck took interest. Zanuck offered her a screen test. In the test footage, Jean smiled nervously, but the camera loved her. Her cheekbones, wide eyes, and steady voice didn't need much coaching. She signed a contract with Fox in 1940, but Jean wasn't just another pretty face. From the beginning, she insisted on roles that didn't box her in. She refused to play dumb or helpless. She even turned down early roles that required her to fake a heavy accent or overact. She wasn't loud, she didn't have to be. Jean Tierney walked into a room and the silence did the rest. By the end of 1940, she'd left Broadway behind and Hollywood was just starting to realize what it had on its hands. Fox signs a starlet. She signed with 20th Century Fox in 1940, and the studio wasted no time molding her into a screen icon. She was 20, fresh from Broadway, and already had a reputation for being impossible to ignore. Her first film under Fox was The Return of Frank James, opposite Henry Fonda. She played Eleanor Stone, an aspiring newspaper reporter. Not exactly the most dazzling part, but it worked. Audiences noticed her, and the studio noticed the box office. Fox knew they had a gold mine, but in the 1940s, a contract meant more than a paycheck. It meant ownership. Studio heads picked your scripts, shaped your public image, and even told you who to date. Jean played along, but she didn't bend easily. She refused to change her name or pluck her eyebrows, which became one of her trademarks. In 1941, she starred in Tobacco Road, followed by Belle Starr, where she played a gunslinging Southern rebel. Both films were hits, but critics weren't kind. Some called her stiff. Others said she was just a face. Behind the scenes, she was quietly taking acting lessons and studying other performers on set. She never wanted to be just a decoration. Fox pushed her harder. By 1942, she was headlining films like Sundown and Rings on Her Fingers, moving quickly between dramas and comedies. The studio plastered her face on posters, pitched her as the most beautiful woman in film, and paired her with big names to boost her status. She didn't complain. She worked constantly. Between 1940 and 1943, she appeared in 9 films, some forgettable, some not. What mattered was the build-up. Zanuck believed Jean was one breakout role away from being a household name. He was right. By the end of 1943, Tierney had clawed her way out of bit parts and into something rare, leading lady status without playing by all the rules. She didn't flirt with the press. She didn't chase controversy. She showed up, hit her marks, and let the camera do the talking. Hollywood was full of loud starlets. Jean Tierney just stood still, and the world came to her. Scandalized in Heaven Can Wait. In 1943, Jean Tierney starred in Heaven Can Wait, a Technicolor fantasy comedy that didn't scream career-defining role, but that's exactly what it became. Directed by Ernst Lubitsch, the film was a polished, high-society romp. Jean played Martha Strobel Van Cleve, a loyal wife who endures a lifetime of her husband's nonsense with quiet dignity and style. Audiences saw something different. She wasn't just beautiful, she was luminous. Critics finally softened. The Los Angeles Times said she outshone the sets, which were designed to look like actual heaven. People couldn't stop talking about her face, her poise, her voice. She seemed untouchable. But the praise came with a strange undercurrent. Behind the camera, Jean was struggling with how Hollywood wanted to present her. The studio insisted she pose for increasingly provocative photo spreads. One publicist described her appeal as elegance with danger. She was uncomfortable with the wardrobe choices but agreed, until one publicity still, showing her in a clingy satin gown, exploded in newspapers across the country. That photo was everywhere. Letters poured in. Some fans were outraged. Others were obsessed. Tierney became the center of unwanted attention. She didn't do interviews about the photo. She didn't complain publicly. But friends later said she hated how that moment changed her image. Studio executives, however, saw dollar signs. The photo in the film cemented her as both a movie star. She was nominated for a National Board of Review award. Suddenly, Jean was headlining every fashion article and fan magazine. Her phone rang non-stop. Directors wanted her. Journalists chased her. She was now the face of a new kind of leading lady, refined, smart, but sold to the public with a wink. Jean didn't fight the wave, but she didn't trust it either. She once told a friend, "They talk about you like you're a painting they just hung." It wouldn't be long before that painting started haunting people. Laura Sparks' obsession. If Heaven Can Wait turned Jean Tierney into a star, Laura, 1944, made her a legend and a ghost. Directed by Otto Preminger, the film was a psychological noir where Jean played the title character, a woman so enchanting that even her supposed death couldn't stop men from falling in love with her. In the movie, a detective investigates her death, only to become obsessed with her portrait. The twist? She's not actually dead. She walks in halfway through the film, alive and graceful, stunning the audience, and him. That portrait became iconic. In real life, it was a photograph touched up to look like a painting. But for many, it didn't matter. Jean became Laura. Strangers wrote letters claiming to have fallen in love with her character. A few even claimed they'd dreamed about her. The obsession crossed into unsettling territory. One man reportedly wrote to Fox requesting the painting for his bedroom. Another sent marriage proposals weekly. Jean didn't find it flattering. She found it eerie. The film was a hit. Critics hailed it as one of the best mysteries of the decade. Jean's performance was praised for being both icy and vulnerable, controlled but emotionally loaded. The camera barely moved when she was on screen. It didn't need to. She received praise from her toughest critic, the press. Even The New Yorker, known for snubbing studio stars, admitted she had an uncanny presence. But the film's success came at a cost. The more people adored Laura, the less they seemed to care about Jean Tierney. The studio leaned in. More posters, more portraits, more mystery woman headlines. Behind the scenes, Jean began feeling erased by the very image that made her famous. Tyrone Power and tragedy. In 1946, Jean Tierney began a romance with Tyrone Power, one of the biggest male stars in Hollywood. He was charming, impossibly handsome, and just as boxed in by fame as she was. They met at a dinner party and clicked immediately. But behind the polished smiles, their connection wasn't smooth. Power had recently returned from World War II service and was emotionally distant. Jean had just wrapped several grueling film projects and was emotionally fragile. Still, they dated quietly for over a year, often traveling to Mexico or sneaking around the studio system's ever-present photographers. She once said he was the only man I ever really loved. Their relationship stalled when Tyrone left to film Captain from Castile Abroad. Jean hoped he'd return ready for marriage. Instead, he came back with distance and a different story. His family reportedly didn't approve of Jean. She wasn't high society enough, despite her upbringing. That rejection crushed her. In 1947, he ended things for good. Jean spiraled. Friends noticed she stopped going out. One co-star said she seemed unreachable. She buried herself in work, but felt abandoned and humiliated. Power's next marriage to a Latin actress, Linda Christian, was a public spectacle. Jean stayed silent but didn't hide her heartbreak from those closest to her. The loss wasn't just personal, it was public. Gossip columns had speculated for months about a wedding that never happened. She became the subject of what went wrong stories and cruel headlines about women being too cold or too controlling. Looking back, it wasn't just a breakup. It was the first public crack in the image Jean had spent years building. The woman who could make men fall in love with a painting had been left behind by the real thing. She never dated Tyrone again, but she never got over him either. Motherhood and silent pain. In 1943, at the height of her fame, Jean Tierney became pregnant with her first child, Daria. She was thrilled. She'd married fashion designer Oleg Cassini earlier that year, and for once, her life seemed steady. But something went horribly wrong. While attending a Hollywood canteen event for soldiers during her early pregnancy, a female fan approached her. The woman had been sick with rubella, German measles, but snuck out of quarantine just to meet Jean. The star, not knowing the risk, greeted her kindly and posed for a photo. Months later, Jean gave birth to Daria. The baby was born blind, partially deaf, and severely developmentally disabled. Doctors confirmed the cause: prenatal exposure to rubella. Jean was devastated. The guilt nearly consumed her. She blamed herself, even though she'd had no idea what had happened until after the fact. Her marriage to Cassini started to crack under the pressure. They argued constantly about treatment, care, and guilt. Cassini wanted to send Daria to a private facility for long-term care. Jean resisted, but eventually agreed, knowing she couldn't give the child the care she needed alone. The fan who exposed her? Years later, that woman approached Jean again, this time at a book signing, and confessed. Jean was polite but shaken. She simply responded, "You have given me the most dreadful sorrow of my life." She almost never spoke about Daria publicly. When she did, it was brief and tightly controlled. She visited her daughter often, sometimes bringing toys or books, but always leaving in tears. This tragedy became a private burden that followed Jean through every film, every red carpet, every fake smile. She kept working, kept showing up, but something behind her eyes had changed. Her fans saw glamour. Her peers saw sadness. One friend said she didn't wear grief, it lived in her voice. Mental hospitals and recovery. By the early 1950s, Jean Tierney was unraveling. The press didn't report it yet, but people on set noticed. She forgot lines, lost weight, and sometimes froze during scenes. She had trouble sleeping. She cried without warning. After finishing The Left Hand of God in 1955, she walked away from Hollywood. She tried to recover privately. Doctors diagnosed her with manic depression, now known as bipolar disorder. She was prescribed barbiturates and given rest orders, but nothing worked. Her mood swung hard, elation one day, despair the next. Friends described her as distant, ghostly. In 1957, she voluntarily admitted herself to the Harkness Pavilion in New York, a psychiatric clinic. When her condition didn't improve, she was moved to the Institute of Living in Connecticut. There, she underwent over 20 rounds of electroconvulsive therapy. She later said she lost big chunks of her memory, including entire scripts and moments from childhood. She stayed in institutions on and off for years. During one break in 1958, she attempted a comeback by working in a department store under a false name. When a customer recognized her, tabloids ran with the story, "Jean Tierney broke, working retail." The truth was more complex. She was trying to feel normal again. The press framed it as a fall from grace. But behind the scenes, she was slowly rebuilding. Therapy helped. Medication changed. She reconnected with friends and even wrote letters to Daria again. She eventually made a cautious return to public life. Not everyone welcomed her back, but some directors remembered what she was capable of. She wasn't cured, but she was stronger. She said later, "You don't come back the same, but you come back." JFK, Romance Rumors Fly. Jean Tierney and John F. Kennedy crossed paths long before he became president. Their connection began in 1946, shortly after Kennedy returned from World War II and was newly elected to Congress. At the time, Jean was separated from her husband, Oleg Cassini, and trying to balance fame, heartbreak, and motherhood. They met through mutual friends in the political and Hollywood circles that often overlapped. Kennedy was young, charismatic, and ambitious. Jean, still recovering emotionally, found comfort in his charm. Their relationship developed quietly. There were dinners, long conversations, and a few public appearances. It wasn't a tabloid frenzy, but insiders noticed. By some accounts, their relationship grew serious. There were rumors of marriage. Jean was Catholic. So was Kennedy. But there was a problem. She was a divorcee, and his political advisors weren't thrilled. Marrying a divorced Hollywood actress didn't exactly align with a clean-cut public image, especially not for a man eyeing the White House. Kennedy ended the relationship. Politely, but clearly. Jean was devastated, though she never spoke ill of him. In her memoir, she referred to a man who ended things due to ambitions beyond personal happiness. Most readers understood who she meant. By the time JFK was elected president in 1960, Jean had moved on, at least publicly. She eventually remarried, leaving Hollywood behind for a quieter life in Texas. The media tried to link them again in the early 60s, but those were just recycled rumors from years past. There was no rekindling, no late-night visits to the White House, no secret second chapter. Come back and advise and consent. In 1962, after years out of the spotlight, Gene Tierney returned to the screen in Advise and Consent, a political drama directed by Otto Preminger, the same man who once directed her in Laura. This wasn't a glamour role. She played the poised wife of a senator, with measured dialogue and a quiet presence. But that was the point. Preminger knew Jean's story. He gave her the role not just for her talent, but as a statement. She still belonged on screen. The film itself was bold, touching on blackmail, government secrets, and even hinted at scandals. Jean held her own alongside heavyweights like Henry Fonda and Charles Lawton. Critics noticed. They praised her restraint, her confidence, and her refusal to overplay a part that could have easily been forgettable. The New York Times said her scenes added a sense of real-world dignity. But Jean's comeback wasn't just about performance, it was about survival. She had weathered a public mental health battle, a divorce, family estrangement, and the brutal judgment of an industry that didn't give second chances to women over 40. She wasn't there to prove she could still be beautiful. She was there to show she was still standing. After Advise and Consent, she made a few more appearances. Nothing major, just select roles. She didn't need the fame anymore. She'd tasted all of it, good and bad. By the mid-1960s, Jean quietly retired from film. She remarried, lived in Houston for a while, and kept her distance from Hollywood drama. She hosted charity events, visited her daughter, and stayed out of the headlines. But for those who watched Advise and Consent, that short return was more than a cameo. It was a quiet reclaiming of a career on her own terms. Secrets revealed in memoir. In 1979, Gene Tierney did something most classic Hollywood stars avoided. She told the truth. Her memoir, Self-Portrait, hit shelves without glamour shots and without the usual spin. It was raw, direct, and devastating. She didn't open with her film roles or red carpets. She opened with Daria. She explained the rubella exposure, the birth complications, and the years of guilt that followed. She described the breakdowns, the shock therapy, and the shame that came with losing control in public. "People think a breakdown is falling apart," she wrote. "Sometimes it's just going numb." She called out the studio system for treating actors like property. She named names, carefully, but clearly. She admitted that at one point she wanted to end her life. She didn't glorify it. She didn't dramatize it. She just said it plainly and moved on. The most surprising part? She didn't sound bitter. Her voice was calm, even wry. She talked about fame as a mirror that never tells the truth. She joked about therapy and described psychiatrists the way other people describe bad directors. Politely, but with a sting. Readers were stunned. This wasn't the Gene Tierney they thought they knew. This wasn't Laura or Heaven Can Wait. This was a woman who had been adored, damaged, institutionalized, ignored, and still found the nerve to say, "Here's what really happened." The book became a quiet hit. It didn't top bestseller lists, but it passed from reader to reader. Film historians called it one of the most honest books to come out of Golden Age Hollywood. Young actresses read it to understand what the business really cost. Jean Tierney didn't give fans the version of herself they wanted. She gave them the truth, and somehow that made her unforgettable all over again. She wasn't the biggest name in Hollywood. In fact, she almost turned down the role. The film itself was a low-budget project nobody expected to succeed. But then came that one scene that changed everything. How did a woman who wasn't Columbia Pictures' first choice outshine Hollywood's top leading men? What led her to this moment, and why is it still considered one of the most iconic performances in film history? The unlikely star. In the early 1930s, if you asked Hollywood about its top female stars, you'd hear names like Greta Garbo, Joan Crawford, and Norma Shearer. These women represented the peak of MGM glamour. But Claudette Colbert? Well, let's just say she was respected in her own right, but she was far from dominating the conversation. Not yet, anyway. Claudette's story is not like most Hollywood tales. She didn't have a tough start, and she didn't fight for small, ungrateful roles. Émilie Claudette Chauchouin, as she was once called, was born in France in 1903. As a child, she moved to New York and grew up in a comfortable middle-class home. Needless to say, she had all she needed and wasn't exactly from a poor household. So how did acting come in? Well, Claudette didn't plan this. From the start, she really wanted to be a painter. The stage, let alone the silver screen, wasn't something she dreamed of conquering. But as you'd suspect, in time, everything changed. Just like a lot of other Hollywood background stories, Claudette suddenly found herself drawn to acting, almost by accident. But one thing was for sure, she wanted to do this for the rest of her life. So she went on to study at the Art Students League of New York before taking acting classes. Now it wasn't like she saw herself as the next big thing or the greatest performer. She simply delved into acting at this time because it seemed interesting and intriguing. At this time, she began to eye Broadway as a goal and not necessarily the golden streets of Hollywood. To her, she wanted to be a stage performer and nothing else. However, fate had other plans. In the late 1920s, there was a massive shift in the film industry. The audiences were tired of the regular actors they were exposed to, and they wanted more. So producers and studios were desperate for fresh actors with stage performance experience. And just like that, preparation meets opportunity, and Colbert, with her refined diction and expressive delivery, fit the bill. She signed a contract with Paramount in 1928, but even then, film was nothing more than a paycheck, a way to supplement her theater work. Hollywood, to her, was a temporary stop, not the destination. She may not have been in love with Hollywood, but Hollywood was certainly in love with her. So despite her reluctance, she found steady work in the film industry. By the early 1930s, she was well regarded, a familiar face on the screen, but not quite a marquee name. Paramount slotted her into a particular type, elegant, poised, sophisticated, and so every role she was cast for was as socialites, aristocrats, and the occasional femme fatale, but rarely as the leading lady in a high-profile project. Comedy, for instance, wasn't what she was known for. The studio saw her as refined, intelligent, and dramatic. At the time, Hollywood's rigid studio system dictated who became a star and who remained just another working actor. The biggest names were tied to powerhouse studios like MGM, Warner Bros., and Paramount, and each had their own roster of carefully groomed stars. MGM was the pinnacle, home to the biggest female icons, while Warner Bros. Was grittier and more fast-talking. Paramount, where Colbert was signed, had a reputation for sophistication but wasn't pushing her as one of their elite leading ladies. She was respected, employed, and successful, but she wasn't a sensation. But if you're wondering how she eventually became a sensation, it was in the most unlikely circumstances ever. It wouldn't come through a role carefully crafted for her. nor would it be in the kind of high-profile drama that studios built around their biggest stars. Instead, it would come in a film that no one wanted, with a part she nearly turned down. The film no one wanted. Now, to understand the origins of this film, you must get the power play in Hollywood at the time. You see, back then, Hollywood was a well-oiled machine, churning out films at an industrial pace, with the biggest studios, MGM, Warner Brothers, and Paramount, holding all the power. On the other hand, Columbia Pictures was not exactly part of that elite club. It was a smaller studio and often dismissed as a poverty row operation. They churned out low-budget films that rarely made a lasting impact. Then this small low-budget studio wanted to put out yet another movie called It Happened One Night. Clearly, no one was expecting anything much from it. It wasn't supposed to be special or break any milestones. It had no A-list actors, and even the director Frank Capra was just trying to make a name for himself at the time. The script, based on a short story called Night Bus, had been floating around Hollywood, failing to generate much enthusiasm. It was supposed to be a simple, light-hearted road trip romance, hardly the kind of film that studios considered important. No one wanted to touch it with a 10-foot pole. The role of Ellie Andrews, the spoiled heiress on the run, had been offered to several leading ladies, but none of them wanted it. Myrna Loy, known for her wit and elegance, turned it down, calling it beneath her. Constance Bennett, another major star, rejected it as well. Even Bette Davis had no interest. No one saw it as a prestigious project, and with Columbia's reputation for lower-budget productions, it wasn't exactly the kind of film actresses were scrambling to be in. And then the role was offered to our very own Claudette Colbert. And well, she too wasn't interested either. She had just finished a grueling shoot and was eager to take a vacation. When the role was offered to her, she dismissed it outright, reportedly saying the script was silly. Columbia wasn't her studio, and she had no desire to take on what seemed like a second-rate project. But Capra, the director, went on to convince her she was the perfect choice. He would not take no for an answer. He kept pushing and being consistent. Finally, Colbert caved, but she made a deal. She would do the film, but only if she was paid double her usual salary and if production wrapped within 4 weeks. She wanted to be out as quickly as possible, back to her planned trip, and she wasn't really expecting the studio to agree, but they did, and just like that, she was locked in. Little did she know that this so-called minor project would change the course of her career forever. The scene that changed everything. During the filming of It Happened One Night, things were rushed and low budget. Overall, it wasn't an entirely spectacular production, but one scene in particular stood out and became one of the greatest scenes in the history of Hollywood, the hitchhiking scene. Interestingly enough, it was a deceptively simple setup. Ellie Andrews and Peter Warne were two unlikely traveling companions and are stranded on the side of the road, desperate to catch a ride. Peter, ever the cocky know-it-all, insists there's a proper technique to hitchhiking. He demonstrates with a series of exaggerated gestures, each one failing more embarrassingly than the last. Meanwhile, Ellie, watching with amused skepticism, finally steps in and she does the most unbelievable thing. Without a word, she lifts her skirt just enough to reveal her bare leg, and just like that, within seconds, a car screeches to a halt. What makes the scene work so well isn't just the humor and the obvious sexiness, it's also the relationship between Colbert and Gable. She isn't only playing the beautiful, flirtatious woman using her looks to get what she wants. She's also effortlessly in control, turning the moment into a masterclass in comedic timing. Her expression, half smug, half innocent, tells us everything. She knows exactly what she's doing, and she's enjoying watching Peter squirm. It's one of those rare moments in romantic comedies where the woman isn't just reacting to the man's antics, she's outsmarting him. What makes it even more fascinating is the tension behind the scenes. Most people find it hard to believe that Colbert was reportedly reluctant to do the leg-bearing moment at all. She considered it too risque and initially refused, forcing Capra to scramble for a solution. The director even hired a body double to perform the scene, but when Colbert saw the stand-in's legs, she scoffed, declaring that hers looked better. In the end, she did it herself, but that initial hesitation worked in her favor. The scene doesn't come across as forced or overly suggestive. Instead, it feels natural, playful, and perfectly in line with her character's blend of sophistication and rebellion. And then there was Gable, playing the perfect straight man. He doesn't overreact or turn the moment into slapstick. Instead, his subtle frustration, his slightly wounded ego, and his wordless resignation make Colbert's performance shine even more. The balance between them, her effortless charm and his exasperated masculinity, made the scene and the film an instant classic. The glorious aftermath. When the film finally hit theaters, critics and audiences were taken aback by the unexpected star power that emerged from what they assumed would be a standard romantic comedy. Clark Gable's rugged charm had long been the draw, but it was Colbert's subtle humor and magnetic presence that quietly upstaged him, transforming her performance into the film's most talked-about moment. But even the viewers had a nice experience with the movie. They found themselves laughing at the antics on screen and at the delightful twist of fate that saw this refined actress become the unexpected heroine of the story. And just like that, glowing reviews began pouring in from every corner. Newspapers, magazines, and even casual chatter among moviegoers praised her as the revelation of the year. It was as if she had cast an enchanting spell over the audience, eclipsing the male lead with her wit, poise, and that irresistible charm that made every gesture memorable. In one sweeping stroke, she challenged the very concept of stardom, prompting even the most skeptical critics to reconsider the established order of Hollywood's leading ladies. As is Hollywood's nature, with a great performance comes great accolades and recognition. The film's triumph at the Academy Awards only solidified this newfound status. As It Happened One Night swept the major categories, Colbert's performance became emblematic of a shifting tide in the industry, a movement where talent and authenticity began to outweigh the traditional markers of star power. This moment of recognition was not just an accolade, it was a turning point that elevated her career to heights previously reserved for the era's most celebrated names. Suddenly, she was no longer seen as merely a supporting presence in a male-dominated landscape, but as a central figure whose work resonated on every level. This surge in recognition ushered Claudette Colbert into the elite circles of Hollywood. Roles that once seemed out of reach became part of her repertoire, and the kinds of characters she portrayed grew richer, more nuanced, and decidedly more challenging. No longer was she the dependable, refined actress of the past. She was now a trailblazer, paving the way for a new kind of leading woman who could balance humor with sophistication and vulnerability with strength. As the echoes of that transformative performance continued to reshape her career, one couldn't help but wonder what daring choices and fresh narratives awaited her next in the ever-evolving world of cinema. More than just a scene. Claudette Colbert's performance in It Happened One Night did more than just change her career. It changed the way Hollywood thought about leading ladies in romantic comedies. Let's break that down. Before this, female characters in the genre often fit into rigid categories. It was either the demure love interest, the glamorous but distant socialite, or the ditzy comedic sidekick. But after the film, It Happened One Night, Colbert completely shattered those expectations by embodying something a little more different, a woman who was witty, elegant, playful, and undeniably in control of her own story. When she portrayed Ellie Andrews, she set a new standard. A standard that said she wasn't there to just react and compliment the male lead like every other film before that time, but she was an equal force in the movie, someone to be taken equally seriously and capable of bringing her own energy. She was very sophisticated, but wasn't also above getting her hands dirty, whether it was dunking a donut with exaggerated precision, delivering sharp comebacks, or cheekily outsmarting Peter at his own game. She was confident yet vulnerable, independent yet romantic, and, most importantly, always interesting to watch. This balance, mixed charm with intelligence, sensuality with humor, became the blueprint for romantic comedy heroines for decades to come. You can see shades of Colbert's Ellie in actresses like Katharine Hepburn, Rosalind Russell, and even later stars like Julia Roberts or Meg Ryan. The idea of the cool, confident, and clever leading lady owes much to what Colbert perfected in that single performance. Despite her many other achievements in Hollywood, her work in Midnight, The Palm Beach Story, and Since You Went Away, nothing quite eclipsed what she did in It Happened One Night. It remains the moment that defines her legacy, the film that turned her from a respected actress into a cinematic icon. Even as Hollywood evolved and new stars emerged, her impact on the romantic comedy genre never faded. Decades later, when audiences look back at the golden age of Hollywood, Colbert's hitchhiking scene, her sharp banter with Gable, and her effortless blend of humor and sophistication still stand as some of the most memorable moments in film history. And in that way, It Happened One Night wasn't just her breakthrough, it was her immortality. What came next? With It Happened One Night turning Claudette Colbert into one of Hollywood's most bankable stars overnight, she suddenly had something that she never had before: power. All of a sudden, she was no longer just a respected actress. She was now a full-fledged leading lady with the ability to choose her roles more carefully and negotiate better deals. And unlike many stars who get typecast after a breakout performance, Colbert refused to be boxed in. After her performance, you'd think she will now solely stick to comedy romance movies, but that was the definition of typecasting, and she wanted no part in that. So rather than simply coasting on the success of screwball comedy, she used her newfound status to explore a range of genres. Admittedly, she did continue making romantic comedies, many of which became classics. She also took on dramatic roles, period pieces, and even wartime films. Her next few years were a masterclass in versatility, proving that her charm and talent could extend far beyond fast-talking heiresses and road trip romance. After a successful movie, there is usually a special bond between the actors and the directors, and this one was no different. She quickly reunited with director Frank Capra in Broadway Bill in 1934, a comedy drama about horse racing, which wasn't as big as It Happened One Night, but reaffirmed her place in the industry. And then came The Gilded Lily in 1935. With that, she cast away all doubts that she was the rom-com queen. Soon enough, audiences eagerly embraced her sophisticated yet playful approach to love stories. For any other actress, this would be enough. She had done her best, and it would be time to stay where she was. But not this time. She wasn't content to just stay in just one lane. So in 1934, she stepped into the shoes of the Egyptian queen in Cleopatra, and with that, she proved to everyone that she could carry an epic historical drama as convincingly as a light-hearted comedy, and make no mistake, this was no easy feat. While the film may not be as widely remembered today as later versions of Cleopatra, it was a major success at the time and showcased her ability to transform into larger-than-life roles. Throughout the late 1930s and 1940s, Colbert continued to balance glamour with depth, starring in films like Midnight in 1939, an underrated romantic comedy that remains a fan favorite, and The Palm Beach Story in 1942, a screwball masterpiece that solidified her reputation as one of the genre's greatest leading ladies. But she didn't shy away from serious work either. Her performance in Since You Went Away in 1944 was a movie about a World War II drama, and it earned her an Oscar nomination and showed audiences a more vulnerable emotional side to her acting. Unlike some of her contemporaries, Colbert managed to maintain her star status for years, carefully selecting roles that played to her strengths while also allowing for evolution. She didn't fade away or burn out. Instead, she adapted. By the time Hollywood's golden age began to shift in the 1950s, Colbert had already built a body of work that ensured her place among the greats. And yet, despite all her success, nothing ever quite matched the cultural impact of It Happened One Night. It remained the defining moment of her career, the performance that secured her a place in film history. But instead of being limited by it, she used it as a launching pad, proving time and again that she was more than just a one-hit wonder. Away from the cameras. When it comes to Claudette Colbert's love life and personal relationships, they were anything but simple. In 1928, she married actor and director Norman Foster, her co-star in the Broadway play The Barker. But their marriage was kept secret for years, and they didn't even live together. Instead, in Los Angeles, Colbert shared a home with her mother, Jean, who reportedly couldn't stand Foster and wouldn't even let him in the house. Unsurprisingly, the marriage didn't last. They divorced in Mexico in 1935. But that was not the end of love for Colbert. Later that same year, on Christmas Eve, Colbert fell in love again and married Dr. Joel Pressman in Yuma, Arizona. He was a respected surgeon who would go on to become a professor and the head of UCLA Medical School's head and neck surgery department. There was no doubt that Colbert clearly adored him and would do anything for him. She even gave him a Beechcraft airplane as a gift. The two went on to settle into a comfortable life together, buying a ranch in Northern California where Colbert spent her time horseback riding, while Pressman raised show cattle. She had a taste for nice things, driving around in a Lincoln Continental and a Ford Thunderbird. For the first time in a long time, Colbert was happy, and unlike her first marriage, this one lasted for a while, 33 years to be exact. But sadly, her fairy tale came to an end when Pressman passed away from liver cancer in 1968. Now, all she had was her mother, and that relationship wasn't even so great. You see, her mother, Jean, was complicated. Jean was known to be difficult, reportedly favoring Colbert's brother, Charles, over her. Charles, who went by the surname Wendling, taken from their grandmother. He acted as Colbert's business manager for a time and was responsible for negotiating some of her best Hollywood contracts in the late 1930s and early 1940s. In 1942, he enlisted in World War II. In the mid-1950s, Colbert finally decided to take a step away from Hollywood, yet she maintained an extravagant lifestyle. She had a weekend house in Palm Springs, and according to an advertising executive, he had this to say: "Claudette was extravagant. I never, ever saw her question the price of anything." She owned a stunning Lloyd Wright-designed home in Holmby Hills, but later sold it in 1963. She and Pressman then rented a smaller house in Beverly Hills. But after Pressman's demise, she thought it was the end for her, until in 1958 she met Verna Hull, a wealthy painter and photographer who happened to be the stepdaughter of a Sears Roebuck heiress. The two were close friends for nearly a decade, traveling together, sharing an interest in art, and even renting matching penthouses in New York. When Colbert bought a home in Barbados in the early 1960s, Hull bought the house next door. Naturally, rumors swirled about their relationship, but Colbert denied anything romantic. Their friendship eventually fell apart after a dramatic argument while Pressman was dying. Hull reportedly claimed that he would rather take Colbert's life, and his own, than pass away alone. That marked the end of their friendship forever, and Colbert ended up living her life away from the spotlight.